I'm Dr. Ron Traylor, and once again, welcome to History 475. This is the second of the recorded video lectures um, that I'm creating this week. All right. When we stopped at the end of the very first video, we were talking about Alexander Hamilton, and I would like to complete or to further uh, discuss Hamilton and his role of the creation of the early United States. Hamilton really respected the British government and British institutions. And the fact that we had just fought a war against England, against Britain, didn't change his respect for the institutions of the nation. He was especially taken with the Bank of England. The Bank of England had created an extraordinarily strong British currency. The Bank of England had created a strong industrial uh, base for England, and Hamilton saw no reason why that should not happen in the brand spanking new United States. And so he himself began to make his support for a national bank known. And it would be known as the Bank of the United States. Um, and Hamilton was convinced that the Bank of the United States could accomplish a number of things that the new nation needed. First of all, he thought that the Bank of the United States would help in creating a uniform currency in the United States, that we could create paper money, hopefully that was backed up by precious metal. Um, and if we did it correctly, it hopefully at some point in the future, the American dollar would be as well respected around the world as the British pound. He also saw the Bank of the United States as a place um, where loans could be made to develop the economy. Businessmen who had an idea but who had no money uh, to to uh, turn their ideas into reality could borrow money from the Bank of the United States, and that capital then would be that money would be used to create new businesses. Now, uh, the Bank of the United States, as Hamilton envisioned it, would be a partnership between the United States government and private investors. Um, Private investors would provide 80%, 4/5 of the money in the bank, and the United States would provide 20% or 1/5 of the capital. Um, the same ratios would be used to determine who would be on the board of directors. Private investors would make up 4/5 of the board of directors. The United States government would provide one out of every five board of directors members. Now, this led the whole idea of the Bank of the United States led to one of the earliest controversies, internal controversies in American history. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson uh, said that such a bank would be unconstitutional. Why? Because they said that only the things that are in the Constitution can be done. And since the Constitution did not mention a Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States was therefore unconstitutional. But there was a deeper conflict here than just the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was just a symptom of something else that was going on. And what else was going on went to the heart of the uh, meaning of the Constitution. Hamilton said that the Constitution is only a guideline, that fundamentally the government should be able to do whatever it chose to do as long as it was not blatantly unconstitutional. In other words, Hamilton and his followers believed in a what was referred to and still is referred to today as a wide interpretation of the Constitution. People like Madison and Jefferson felt 180 degrees the other way. They believed that you could only do what the Constitution said. They believed in what we refer to as a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. You couldn't do whatever you wanted to just because you wanted to. You couldn't even do anything that you wanted to, even if it was good for everybody. Those two opposing ideas, uh, uh, that loose interpretation, that wide interpretation of the Constitution, as opposed to that narrow interpretation, would lead to the creation of the first two political parties in American history. Now, prior to the creation of those two parties, people like Washington distrusted political parties. He said, fundamentally, that political parties do more harm than good. England already had political parties, and Washington blamed a lot of the problems that England was having on the politics, the different politics of the differing political parties. What Washington said was that everybody ought to believe the same thing politically. Now, from the vantage point of the year 2020, that sounds rather naive of us, especially coming from Washington, who was pretty much a realist. But nevertheless, that's what he said. And there were a lot of people who believed, as he did, that political parties were bad, that they caused more problems than they solved. Well, be that as it may, this disagreement over the Bank of the United States, which, as I said, went really deeper than simply a disagreement over the bank. It went to the interpretation of the Constitution. That problem resulted in the creation of the first two political parties in the United States. Now, here they are. The party that was created by Alexander Hamilton was called the Federalist Party. Now, let me stop right here and tell you that the Federalist Party had nothing to do with the old Federalist faction that had supported the ratification of the Constitution, even without a Bill of Rights. The two things are totally different. As a matter of fact, I will tell you what I have told many people in the past. I wish that Hamilton would have chosen a different term to describe his party. I don't care what he called it as long as he didn't call it the Federalist Party, because still people today believe that the Federalist Party and the old Federalist group that had supported the Constitution without a Bill of Rights is the same group, and that's not true. Okay, so get that out of your system, please. On the exam, here it is. True or false? The Federalist Party and the Federalist faction that supported ratification of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights were the same group. True or false? And the answer is false. Nevertheless, they were called the Federalists, and the name stuck, and we've just got to learn to live with it. Now, Madison and Jefferson opposed, right, the Bank of the United States. But once again, even deeper than that, they believed in a very narrow interpretation of the Constitution, and they called themselves the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans. And I'm not going to spoil the story for you and tell you that in years later, the Democratic Republicans would split and blah, blah, blah. Right now, they are the Democratic Republicans. But quite often, though, I mean, that's sort of a mouthful, right? It's almost like a tongue twister, the Democratic Republicans. Quite often, we simply refer to them as the Republicans. As long as you know that the real name of the party was the Democratic Republicans. In order to understand the beliefs and the policies of the Federalists and the Republicans, you really only need to know what one party felt. Because if you master, for example, if you master what the Federalists believed in, then if you say the Republicans believe the exact opposite, you're probably going to be pretty close to being right. Okay. So, um, what did the Federalists, led by Hamilton, believe in? Well, they believed in a diversified capitalist society. Um, they believed in an economy that was made of three parts: agriculture, commerce. Commerce is a fancy word for business, for buying and selling, right? Commerce. And industry. So a combination of agriculture, commerce, and industry. The Federalists would have described the economy, the three parts of the economy, as a three-legged stool, and the legs are all the same length. So agriculture, commerce, and industry would be of equal importance to a Federalist. Federalists feared anarchy. And what is anarchy? It's the lack of law. It's not just disobedience of law. It's uh, the lack of law at all. So the Federalists feared anarchy and they loved order. They loved, we would say they loved to dot all the I's and cross all of the T's. The Federalists wanted a strong central government that was run by wealthy capitalist elites. Now, that sounds suspiciously like England, doesn't it? Well, that shouldn't surprise us because Hamilton and the Federalists admired all of these English institutions and English traditions. And it shouldn't surprise us that Hamilton and the Federalists desired a really close working relationship between the United States and England. Although, as we have already said, we had just came out of the war, the American Revolution, with England. Now, on the other side of the coin, there are the Democratic Republicans, the Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. Now, quite often, poor James Madison uh, is sort of left out of the equation here. We tend to talk about the party of Jefferson when we talk about the Republican Party, but the reality is that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't ignore Madison. It was as much his party as it was Mr. Jefferson's party. So who were these Republicans? Well, um, they feared the growth of cities. Um, because they were afraid that the growth of cities was going to result into conflict between the wealthy elites and the working class people. What they feared was not anarchy like the Federalists, they feared tyranny. And what is tyranny? Being forced to do things that you don't want to do, right? Tyranny. And they loved liberty. So, in another way, the Republicans are the opposite of the Federalists. The Republicans wanted just enough government to survive. They would really preferred that government be rather weak and rather decentralized. They really wanted to keep most of the political power in the hands of the individual states and keep power out of the hands of the national government. And if you understand that they were really afraid of tyranny, then that makes sense, doesn't it? He wanted, Jefferson also believed in agriculture and commerce and industry, but he didn't believe that they should be equal. Jefferson and Madison felt that agriculture should be the primary driver of the economy, and that commerce and industry should be there, should be making an important contribution, but that they should we would say, take a back seat to agriculture. He didn't oppose industry, but what he feared was that unlimited industrial, pardon me, that one sort of sneaked up on me. He feared that if industry got too big, that people would begin to abandon their farms and would move into the towns. Where were the industries located? In the towns. They would abandon the farms, they would move into the towns, they would get wage, getting paid wages on an hourly basis, and they would lose their independence. Jefferson believed in something called, that we like to call the Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. Agrarian. That's a descriptive term for agriculture. What Jefferson believed was that every American should be a small farmer. And the size of his farm should depend on the size of his family. The bigger his family, the bigger his farm should be. That each American farmer would raise everything that he needed himself, and then he would raise a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering here. He would raise a little bit extra and sell that for cash, and then he would use that cash to buy the things that he couldn't raise himself. For example, if you wanted gunpowder, chances are likely you didn't know how to make gunpowder yourself. So you would raise a little extra corn or a little extra indigo or a little extra tobacco, sell that, and then buy the gunpowder, something that you needed but you couldn't raise yourself. Now, that doesn't sound bad, but Jefferson then said the moment that you leave the farm and take a job in town, you lose your independence because out on the farm, you decide when you're going to get up in the morning. You decide when you're going to go to bed at night. You decide what you're going to do that day. Right? You decide what crops you're going to raise, on and on and on. The decision belongs to the property owner. But when you sell the farm and move into town and take that job in that factory, you are no longer independent. Your foreman is telling you when to show up and when to go home. Your boss is determining how much you're going to get paid. Your boss is determining what the thing will be that you're going to make. Jefferson uh, feared that a a um, a class of property-less wage earners would be the result with the accompanying loss of independence. And to a degree, Jefferson was right. All of us, I mean, there are very few of us uh, that are absolutely and totally independent financially. Most of us have to work for a living. And because we have to work for a living, we have to obey the rules of the workplace, don't we? We go to work at a particular time, we stop working at a particular time, right? So many of the things that Jefferson, now, is it as bad as he envisioned? I don't think so. But many of the things that he was afraid of have actually come true. And on top of all this, Jefferson preferred to cultivate a closer relationship with the French. So remember what I said? If you can figure out what one party liked, you also automatically knew what the other party disliked. Now, there were a number of crises that took place in the late 1700s during the presidency of George Washington. Um, there were continuing disputes between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists being led by Hamilton, the Democratic Republicans being led by Jefferson and Madison. Um, Washington tried not to take sides, but he was unable to do that. He had to take sides at some point. And even though he really respected Jefferson and Madison, the reality is that he loved Hamilton. They went back a long way, and they were literally, I think I mentioned it, Hamilton was the son that Washington never had. So when push came to shove, we referred to Washington as being a member of the Federalist Party, not the Democratic Republican Party. Uh, Washington was unanimously reelected in 1792. And no sooner was he reelected than foreign problems began. Now, let's talk about the impact of the French Revolution on the United States. In order to do that, we've got to go back to the American Revolution. In order to really understand the French Revolution, we've got to go back to the American Revolution. England and France, over the years, had fought a series of wars. Why they fought them, over what they fought them, is really not important to us. What is important is to know that a series of wars had been fought between the English and the French over the years. And even though England would have different allies in one war and the French would have different allies in another war, there was one thing that was always common. The English won each and every one of those wars. France couldn't win against England. And of course, uh, the last of those wars that was fought between France and England was the French and Indian War. Now, the American Revolution rolls around. Uh, Nobody in their right mind would have ever predicted that the United States could have ever defeated England in a revolution. The smart money, the Vegas money, was on the English. The Americans desperately needed the help of a powerful nation, and that help did not appear for a while. It was not until after the Battle of Saratoga that America was finally recognized by an important country, and that country was France. Now, why did France support the United States? The United States was well on its way to becoming a democratic republic, and France certainly was not a democratic republic. It was a monarchy. In fact, it was a very strict monarchy. The French kings had no interest in democracy or republicanism, and yet the French decided to help the United States. Why? Well, there's a really simple reason why. The French thought that with the help of the Americans, they could finally defeat the English in a war. And so France becomes the first ally of the United States. In 1778, the Americans and the French had signed a treaty. It was called the Treaty of Alliance between France and the United States. And in that treaty, the United States promised to help the French if the French were attacked, and the French promised to help the Americans if we were attacked. And the French government was so obsessed. That's a good word. That's not an overuse of that word. They were obsessed with defeating England. And so they poured more money into the American Revolution than they should have because it was so important for them to win against the English. Well, the English did lose. The French did, along with the Americans, win the American Revolution. The treaty that ended the American Revolution was the Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1783. In 1789, only 6 years later, the French Revolution takes place. So the French have a revolution of their own. Many reputable historians are convinced that the reason, let me adjust this. How's that? A little better. Many historians are convinced that because the French overspent in helping the Americans, that they bankrupted their treasury. And as the years went by, they were not able to take care of the poor people of France the way they should have. And the poor people of France rose up in rebellion against the French monarchy, and the result was the French Revolution. So you can make a strong argument that the French Revolution was a direct result of the American Revolution. It's not that the French were revolting uh, for democracy and republicanism. The French were revolting because they were hungry, right? What did the Empress of England say when she was told that the mob was outside the gates of the palace? She said, "Let them eat cake," which proves how out of touch she was with her own people. They didn't even have bread, much less cake. Well, the French Revolution takes place during the first few months of Washington's first term. Americans at first were solid supporters of the French Revolution because Americans thought that the French Revolution was being fought for the same reasons as the American Revolution had been fought. Americans supported the French Revolution up to a point. And what was that point? When the French Revolution turned bloody, in other words, when Frenchmen started killing other Frenchmen, when they dragged the guillotine out and started chopping off the heads of their political opponents, that is when the attitudes of the Americans began to change. And they began to move away from support for the French Revolution. By the time that France, and eventually France would go to war with its neighboring countries, Belgium and Spain, and then a little fella from Corsica by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte would come to power in France, and he then would try to conquer the rest of Europe. There was a problem. Remember, in 1778, when the United States needed the French help so much, the United States had signed the Treaty of Alliance with the French, promising mutual help. One of the characteristics of the Treaty of Alliance was that it didn't have an ending date. All right? Um, Look at a carton of milk in your refrigerator. It's got an expiration date, right? It says used by, and if it turns bad, you throw it away, right? It has an expiration date. You replace it. The Treaty of Alliance did not have an expiration date. Theoretically, at least, it ran forever. The United States was forever obligated to help France, and France was forever obligated to help the United States. And both countries were willing to do that as long as the French were ruled by a king. But the French Revolution takes place, and all this blood. I mean, blood is running in the streets of France. Every major city in France, people are getting their heads chopped off. And then the French start to attack their neighbors. Now, according to the Treaty of Alliance, what does this obligate the United States to do? It obligates the United States to join the French in trying to conquer Europe. And that sounds a little goofy, but that's what it said. And of course, we didn't want to do that. We wanted nothing to do with conquering Europe. But what were we going to do? We wanted to get out of the treaty, but how would we accomplish that? Well, one of the things that Washington does is that he decides that the United States, now, by this time, of course, I'm making a very long and complicated story very short and simple. So please forgive me that. But nevertheless, what Washington decides to do is to keep the United States neutral in these European wars between France and everybody else. He will try to be just as fair as he can be. He won't take sides. He won't support one nation over another. He won't support one side over another. He will continue to do business with everybody. He won't ignore anybody's money. So Washington had a neutrality proclamation passed through the United States Congress. Now, looked at from the American point of view, this was a very good idea because they were not only trading with France, they were trading with everybody else too. The Americans were getting rich. They were bringing the money in hand over fist through using the concept of neutrality. We're going to stay out of this. Y'all kill each other, but we are not going to get involved. For once, Hamilton on one side and Jefferson and Madison on the other side agreed on something. They agreed on the concept of neutrality, although they disagreed on how it should be implemented. Okay, but generally they agreed on the idea of neutrality, and that neutrality proclamation was issued in April of 1793. It declared that the United States, quote, would be, quote, friendly and impartial toward the belligerent power. Sounds good from the American point of view, but you can see that this would not go over really big in Europe uh, on either side. Because it didn't take long for the British, for example, to begin to resent America's trading with France and France's allies. The English they made a strong point when they said, whenever you help France economically, that economic help can be translated into military power. And of course, the English made the same argument. Um, the French made the same argument. Anytime that you trade with England, that economic help can be used to strengthen England economically, militarily. And so both sides began to resent the idea of American neutrality. Both sides began to say to America, you got to make a decision. All right. Who are you going to support? And who are you going to oppose? Now, at about the same time that all this is taking place, there's something else that's happening. Remember, it's in the 1790s, the early 1790s. The American Revolution has only been over since 1783, so it's only been 10 or 11 years since the war ended. Remember who our mother country was? It was England. I would imagine. There's no way I can prove this. Look, if any of you ever invent a time machine, please let me know because I want to go back to 1793 and I want to see what the American accent was. Did we still speak with an English accent? Or were we already beginning to develop a unique American accent? Things like that uh, bother me. Okay, so don't forget. Call me when you invent the time machine. I suspect that none of you have invented the time machine yet, because if you had, I'd have already been back to 1793 and I could have answered this. Well, stop it. All right. Here's the thing, though. England was being hurt by American neutrality. American ships were doing business with the French and with the French allies. What the British began to do is they began to stop American ships out in the middle of the ocean and ask for proof about the destination of the American ships. And if the American ship was sailing into a French port or into a port of a French ally, the British were confiscating the cargoes to make sure that it didn't get to France, that it didn't help the French. They confiscated the cargoes. Sometimes they even confiscated the ship. And they did something now. And those two things angered many Americans, right? Confiscating the cargoes, confiscating the ships. But the thing that really, really angered the Americans was something else that the British were doing. Uh, the the British Navy would stop an American ship out in the middle of the ocean, and they would have the American crew line up on the deck, and they would go down the line, and they would have each American say something. And if they spoke with an English accent, they would take them off the ship and force them into the British Navy. The assumption was that they had deserted from the British Navy. Now, some of them probably did desert from the British Navy, but most of them simply were unfortunate enough to still have that British accent. This really angered Americans. And so, in many Americans began to call for another war with England. Well, Washington knew that he was lucky to have won the first American Revolution, And he certainly did not want to get involved with another war. So what he does is he sends John Jay, um, who is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He sends John Jay to England to try to reach a diplomatic solution with this problem. Now, what were Washington's orders to John Jay? What was it that Washington wanted to wanted John Jay to get out of the British? Well, one of the things that he ordered Jay to do is to get the British soldiers off American soil. As late as 1794, 1795, there were still British soldiers on American soil uh, in uh, in forts that had been built by the British on the American frontier that should have been handed over to the Americans at the end of the American Revolution, but they're still there. One of the reasons they're still there is to control the fur trade. Remember, we said, no, we didn't say it. It might have been another class. Nevertheless, I'll tell you for the first time now. The fur trade was an extraordinarily profitable business venture. And quite often the British Army protected the British merchants who were buying the furs from the Indians. And that goes a long way to explaining why British soldiers were still in these forts that were on American soil 10 years after the American Revolution had ended. So Jay has his instructions to get the British out of their forts on American soil up along the Canadian border because that's where most of them were. He also wanted Jay to get money from the British. He wanted to be paid. He wanted to be compensated for the value of the ships and the cargoes that had been confiscated by the British ships. By this time, 300, as many as 300 American ships have been stolen by the British on the high seas. Um, he also instructed Jay to get compensation from the British for the value of the American slaves who had left the country when the British Army, when most of the British Army left to go back to England. Now, that's an interesting story. And let me devote some time to that. Both the Americans and the British had used slaves in the American Revolution. Um, the Americans had used them as a labor force, and honestly, the Americans had also put rifles into the hands of some of the slaves, and the slaves fought on the side of the Americans. And the reason why they fought on the side of the Americans was that the Americans promised them, if the Americans won the American Revolution, the Americans promised them their freedom. Look, that's a tantalizing piece of fruit, isn't it? Many of those slaves were willing to risk losing their lives for a chance at freedom. Well, the British made the same promise. Now, I find no record that there were black soldiers, slave soldiers, fighting for the British. But I do know that many of the slaves labored for the British, and the British made the same promise. Of course, they were convinced they were going to win the war. They didn't say if we win the war, they said when we win the war, we will free you. So both sides are making the same promise. Well, the British lose the war. But to their credit, when the British soldiers leave, when they load on the boats and sail out of America, many slaves were on those ships. The British did their best to keep their promise, even though they had lost the war. Now, Washington had He gave Jay orders to try to get compensation for the value of the slaves that had left the United States and gone with the British Army. Also, Washington wanted Jay to get the British to agree that the United States could trade with the British West Indies. Now, the British West Indies are in the Caribbean, and some of the more important islands of the British West Indies are Jamaica, Barbados, islands like that. Rich, rich islands. Uh, Mostly raised sugarcane, and of course, they used slave labor to raise the sugar. Now, sugarcane was so profitable that if you owned a sugar plantation, you planted every possible square inch of land in sugarcane. Stories are told that none of these plantation homes in the British West Indies had front yards. Uh,